Welcome all to this webinar where you're going to get a lot of information about the US Air Force Secret Space Program. And one of the things that is really helpful in understanding this topic is that there is just so much information out there that is relevant to this whole concept of a US Air Force Secret Space Program. Now, I first came across the idea back in 2001 when I saw the Disclosure Project press conference video with that Dr. Stephen Greer had organised, and there were a number of witnesses there that talked about things that were really suggestive of an extraterrestrial presence, but there were also witnesses that talked about things that were not extraterrestrial but were basically created by the US military. And one of those people I will be referring to during this seminar. But essentially, back in 2001, there were just kind of like a few references to these alien reproduction vehicles that the Air Force and some of the major companies like Lockheed Martin was involved in. Around that time as well, there were a few people talking about their involvement in secret space programs. Michael Ralph was probably one of the first to say that he was part of a secret space program, that he spent 20 years on Mars as part of this program. So that was back in the year 2000. And so when I first heard of that, I was pretty amazed and just kind of put it in my, this is something to come back to basket, because it really is amazing information when we start processing exactly what the military has been doing as far as secret space programs are concerned. So as far as the US Air Force's secret space program, we do know a lot, but it's spread out all over the place. And one of the things that as a researcher, one of the things I'm trained to do, that I feel I'm good at, is synthesizing all of that information into a coherent framework, into something that you can understand as what has been going on. So really this seminar is really part of my effort to understand what the US Air Force has been doing. And when Neil and I first talked about starting this seminar, I think it was soon after the Dimensions of Disclosure conference back in 2018, I hadn't yet started doing my in-depth research into this topic. And as a result, since that time, I have done a lot of research, and it's come out in the new book. So let me start my video so that we can now, so you can see exactly what's been going on. So hopefully you can see that. The research that I've done since the Dimensions of Disclosure conference, I started writing about my research back in September of 2018, and so now that's finally seen the light of day in this new book. I'm very excited about it. It's coming out on this month, May 21st, so that's 10 days from today. It'll go live, and you can pre-order now, of course. One of the things that I have added to in this is, to the title, is Space Force. One of the things I realized in discussing the Air Force's secret space program and the whole shifting ET alliances, I mean, there's a lot of information there that I'm going to be presenting. But Space Force is very important to all of this, because I think it's much more behind it than what people might think. So what I'll be doing is finishing off this presentation with a little bit of an idea, some information about Space Force, so you can get an idea of exactly what it is Space Force is all about, what's really behind it. So, so that's what we're going to be doing. So let me begin from where I think is a really useful starting point. If you want to understand where did this whole secret development of an Air Force space program begin, for that matter, where did the Navy's space program research and development efforts begin? Really, the first case that is really relevant is this one. the Los Angeles air raid incident from February 24, 25 to 1942. Even though in the United States there was an earlier case of a UFO crash, that was the 1941 Cape Girardeau craft crash that was in Missouri in the United States. That was retrieved by the US Army. What made this Los Angeles air raid different was that it was witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people in the Los Angeles area. They all saw the searchlights, the UFOs that were being lit up, and the anti-aircraft guns that were being shot off to try and shoot down these craft that were just moving very, very slowly, and in some cases even just hovering. So at that time, the helicopters had just been developed. They were still pretty much in a kind of experimental stage. Some were, being kind of fast-tracked for use in the upcoming war effort. But nevertheless, there was nothing in the US arsenal that could be any way kind of approximate what these kinds of aircraft could do, what these hovering craft could do that were just kind of silently moving over the sky. And so one of the things about this incident was that there are a lot of engineers, a lot of major aircraft companies located in the Los Angeles area at the time. We might not think it so important today, but back in the early 1940s, Los Angeles was a hub for aircraft research and development. All the major companies were there. Lockheed, Donald Douglas Aircraft Company was there. Northrop had already started up down there. There were Voltaire, a lot of other major aircraft companies had their hubs in Los Angeles. And so it was definitely a place where you had a lot of aircraft research and design happening. And so when the organizers, or when the engineers, the owners of these companies started to discuss or saw what was hovering over the skies of Los Angeles, it became a big deal. And so this is really where we can date the beginning of all of this. Now, 2 days after the Los Angeles aircraft raid, there was a secret memorandum. There was a number of memorandums between President Roosevelt and his Secretary of War, and this was something where Roosevelt basically was informed that 2 craft had been shot down from Los Angeles. And so what Roosevelt did was that he decided that this was something that was going to fall under the Army's sphere of influence. That Roosevelt was advised by his science advisor, Dr. Vannevar Bush, that the Army was, of all the military services, the one that was most competent in major project research and development efforts. The Army, for example, was in charge of the Manhattan Project. General Gordon Graves was in charge of the development of the atomic bomb, and that was all run through the Army. So the Army was all responsible for research and development, for secrecy and so forth. And so when it came to these captured flying saucers, or these drone craft that had been shot down from over Los Angeles, Roosevelt assigned the responsibility to the Army. So the Army was responsible for this, and he told the Army not to share that with the USSR. And the US Navy was really basically going to be offering a support to the Army's efforts to really get to the bottom of all of this. Now, one of the people that was present at the time was William Tompkins, and probably for many of you, William Tompkins doesn't need much of an introduction. He recently passed away, but he was 93 when he emerged into the public arena in 2016 with his book Selected by Extraterrestrials, and he began to talk about his experiences being involved in working with the Douglas Aircraft Company, being involved with a Navy intelligence group that was operating out of Naval Air Station San Diego. So he had a lot of information about that. Interestingly, at the time of the Los Angeles air raid, he was actually living in Long Beach, Los Angeles, and so he was a witness. He saw the craft flying overhead and so forth, and he says that there were 2 craft that had been retrieved, and so this matches some of the documents. The document you see here, the Majestic document. These are a number of documents that were leaked that have not been accepted as the Department of Defense, the Army, Air Force, Navy haven't accepted these documents as genuine because they've been leaked, and they're typically secret, top secret, double top secret even, really high classification, and they give a lot of information. And people who have done research on these documents believe they're authentic, and I believe they're authentic. So that's why I'm using them in this presentation and in the book. So these documents are very helpful in understanding what's going on. They give us a history of how the Los Angeles air raid incident and the retrieval of 2 flying saucer craft from that crash that had been shot down, that this was something that basically was very important in kickstarting the research and development efforts of both the US Army and the Navy. William Tompkins was a witness to this. He says that what happened immediately after the incident was that the Douglas Aircraft Company, which back in that day, back in the early 1940s, was a major aerospace company or an aircraft company. Today, it's been absorbed into the Boeing Aircraft Company, as well as all of the classified research facilities it had, one of which Tompkins worked in, which was called Advanced Design, that was doing all of the top secret research on the flying saucer and other extraterrestrial related craft that the Army or the Navy had retrieved from all over the world. So anyway, so back here, Bill Tompkins says that the Douglas Aircraft Company created an informal Navy and Army Air Force task group to investigate flying saucer data dating from the Los Angeles air raid, which included 2 retrieved craft. So the Douglas Aircraft Company was a critical part of this from the very beginning. And one of the things that Bill Tompkins says that he did when he was working at Naval Air Station San Diego from 1942 to 1946 during the Second World War, when the Navy was running a group of spies out of Nazi Germany doing espionage in the flying saucer program that the Germans were running, that Tompkins was taking these, Tompkins was creating briefing packets based on the debriefings of these Navy spies, and then taking the briefing packets to any aircraft company that was capable of understanding what lies behind, understanding the principles behind anti-gravity flying saucers and any kind of advanced aerospace craft that Tompkins was being exposed to through these Navy spies. So as you can see there on your screen, you have the Douglas Aircraft Company with some statistics. It built 30,000 warplanes during World War II. So that gives you an idea of just how big and how important this company was, not only to the United States war effort, but also to the research and development. And on the right-hand side, on your right, you see these briefing, slips, these travel slips that Bill Tompkins gave that show that he was given permission by the admiral running Naval Air Station San Diego at the time to carry briefing packets out of San Diego, out of the Naval Air Station, to different places. So this document here on the right is one of many documents that Tompkins has provided. that corroborates his story that he was taking all of this information about the Germans' flying saucer program to different companies, to different research institutions, to the army, to the navy's kind of premier research facilities, including the Douglas Aircraft Company. Now, the Douglas Aircraft Company set up the RAM project, and also within it, it set up the Advanced Design think tank to study anti-gravity principles and extraterrestrial craft. Because you have the 1942, you have the Los Angeles air raid incident. And then in 1947, you have the Roswell crash. And in 1947, of course, the United States Air Force is created out of the Army Air Force. The Army Air Force was itself created in 1941, and it was a merger between the U.S. Army Air Corps and the Army General Headquarters. So these were two aircraft fleets, independent aircraft fleets that the Army had at the time, and they merged in 1941 to become the U.S. Army Air Force. And they were headed by a five-star general, General Arnold. And so he was the one that he was one of the people involved in this study group that Bill Tompkins said was involved with the Project RAN that was formally set up in October of 1945 from money provided by General Arnold to the Douglas Aircraft Company to get to the bottom of the flying saucer phenomenon, to really understand it, and what are the principles behind it, and give us some information about how extraterrestrials kind of factor into all of this. So this was part of the real goal in the setting up of the RAN project in 1945. And by 1948, so 3 years later, the RAN project basically split off. It was separated into two components. One became a new company called RAND Corporation that emerged in 1948, and the other was Advanced Design in Douglas that Bill Tompkins went to work with. Now, the important thing here for us is that the RAND Corporation, from its inception, was a US Air Force run operation. It was funded by money provided by General Arnold from the Army Air Force. He provided, in 1945, he provided, what was it? I think it was $10 million, which in today's term was was hundreds of millions. I don't know the exact figure off the top of my head, but it was quite a substantial piece of money just for a company to do some planning on how to understand advanced aerospace concepts. But the real goal behind the RAND Corporation and the Project RAND was always to do with extraterrestrials. So this was something Bill Tompkins actually said, and so there's proof for this. The proof comes in a majestic document that is focused on studying extraterrestrial artifacts, and this includes RAND, the RAND project, amongst the entities that was there to study retrieve flying saucer craft from the Roswell incident. So this is the White Hot report. It's dated September 19, and it identifies different entities based on all available evidence collected from recoverable exhibits. It's currently under study by, mentions a number of acronyms. So that's the Air Material Command, Air Force Special Weapons Program, NEPA, off the top of my head, I can't remember, the Atomic Energy Commission, Office of Naval Research, National Aviation Committee for Aeronautics, and so on and so on. And then it mentions RAND and MIT, US Army Air Force. So it gives us some of the different companies or entities involved in studying extraterrestrial artifacts. And this is important because it proves that Project RAND in 1947 was studying retrieved extraterrestrial artifacts. And remember, at this time in 1947, Project RAND was totally within the Douglas Aircraft Company. And that's where Bill Tompkins later worked and where he was located within the advanced design. So this is all consistent with what Tompkins was saying. So this is telling us that yes, the RAND project, Douglas Aircraft Company were all involved in studying retrieved extraterrestrial artifacts. Now, what happened was that Project RAND in 1948, as I mentioned, it separated into the RAND Corporation, and the remnants became known as Advanced Design within the Douglas Aircraft Company. And this is important for tracking the development of secret space programs in the United States, because it gives us an idea of how the Army Air Force and then the US Air Force began doing its research and development on flying saucer craft, and how the Navy was doing it through the Douglas Aircraft Company, which continued to host its remnant of Project RAND within Advanced Design. Now, the Navy, Air Force take different approaches. According to, at the time, he was a Major General, Curtis LeMay. He eventually became the four-star general and Army Chief of Air Force Chief of Staff. He was then Deputy Chief of the Air Staff for Research and Development. And so his view was that space operations were to be considered an extension of air operations. So he was one of many Air Force officers that believed that space was rightfully the domain of the US Air Force. And so you have here the first study conducted by the Project RAND on an experimental world-circling spaceship. So that was published in May of 1946. So that shows you that way back in 1946, the Army Air Force, because that's what it was at the time, was planning to build spacecraft that would be able to perform Earth orbiting functions. And this really is very important, because this really is where the Air Force put a lot of resources, a lot of energy into developing craft capable of orbiting the Earth to conduct surveillance and, if necessary, to become weapons platforms for any future war effort. So, this was in 1946. You had the first study commissioned by the Army Air Force to look at what kind of spacecraft could be developed by the Air Force for Earth orbit. One of the concepts, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, was the Von Braun space station. So this is an illustration of it, a 1952 illustration, but there was actually a 1946 drawing, which I'll talk a little bit about soon because of the way in which it was configured. But this gives you an idea of what the Air Force was thinking about. That they're thinking, okay, we want to build space stations up there, because not only will they be capable of kind of Earth surveillance, they'll also be capable of kind of like monitoring space traffic, like satellites and so forth, and also eventually become weapons platforms, or be used as a platform for outer space exploration. So these were some of the concepts behind the Von Braun station. And so Werner von Braun, as all of you know, was a prominent figure within the Air Force and later within the Navy in terms of developing rocket technologies and the Apollo program. In contrast, the Navy was always interested in the research and development of flying aircraft carriers for space battle groups. So this is a drawing here, or this is a photo, an actual photo of the USS Akron that was operational from 1931 to 1933. And so the Navy was very interested in this particular track. They weren't interested so much in Earth orbiting space stations. They were more interested in developing these kinds of space, a flying aircraft carrier, but for deep space. So projecting naval power into deep space. So that's the track that the Navy took, and I go into depth into that in the book, the US Navy's Secret Space Program and Nordic Extraterrestrial Alliance. So you can see exactly how the Navy did it. But in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the Air Force. Now, one of the things that we are going to look at kind of very quickly, and all of the topics I'm discussing at the moment, I've developed at length in the book, the US Air Force Secret Space Program. Where you have a lot of the references and a lot more details. So I'm just giving you an overview in this presentation of really what the book covers and what we know about the Air Force's Secret Space Program and how all that relates to this current effort by the Trump administration to set up Space Force. So the German breakaway group in Antarctica was known to the US military after Operation High Jump. So that was 1946, and many of you, I'm sure, have heard of this battle that took place down in Antarctica between Admiral Byrd's expedition, naval expedition, where 4,800 Marines and sailors went down there with in 3 naval task forces to basically find and, if not conquer, at least then to finally destroy the Nazi bases. But what happened was that the Nazis had by then perfected their flying saucer craft with directed energy weapons, and so the Navy was no match for them. So the Navy got a bloody nose after Operation High Jump. And so many people are kind of aware of that. Many people are not so aware that the same thing happened in the US mainland, that the German space program began overflights of the United States soon after the Operation High Jump. And what happened with the Navy down in Antarctica, very soon similar things would begin happening to the Air Force over US territory. And the first clue of that is these flying crescent-shaped craft that Kenneth Arnold saw in June of 1947. He said he saw a kind of squadron of 9 of these. So this was only 3 months after Admiral Byrd warned of a new enemy that could fly from either pole to pole to attack the United States. So he saw 9 of these flying crescents, and that's significant because it tells us that these were not an experimental craft, because typically when you are developing experimental craft, you're doing your research and development, typically the way in which companies do it is they develop 2 models, and that they just basically rotate those 2 prototypes for the research and development. And then if the prototypes pass all the tests, then they go into development, and then you have squadrons being purchased by the military services. Well, to have 9 of these flying in formation tells us that this was not an experimental craft, that this flying crescent, which is very similar to the Horton flying wing that was developed by the Horton brothers, who in that period of time were in South America. So they were working down there with these on these kinds of radical flying wing type craft, that they were developing these down in South America and working closely with the Antarctic Germans as well, that these craft had been operationalized and were now flying over US territory. So and you can see the similarities there. So I think that's something, and one of the things that's very important to keep in mind is that when the Project Blue Book began, which was well, actually, the forerunner to Project Blue Book was Project Sign. That began in 1947. That was a US Air Force investigation. Their initial view was that these flying saucer sightings were Russian craft based on German flying saucer designs. So I think right there you get close to the truth, that the Air Force suspected that there was a German connection, but they thought that the Soviets had made these. They didn't know, at least the rank and file of the Air Force didn't know, that the Germans had survived the Second World War and were flying these things out of South America and Antarctica. So, as I mentioned, Werner von Braun was a major part of the rocket program for the United States Air Force, for the United States Army, and the V-2 rockets that had been brought over from Germany to the United States. Many of these were basically retrofitted, put onto launching pads, and then flown and tested. This had become part of the Army's ballistic missile program, and this was something that von Braun was playing a prominent role in. And from the very beginning of these German V-2 rockets being tested by the Army and the Air Force, they began to experience problems, that there was UFO disruption of these flying saucers. And so here you have a case beginning May 15, 1947, where you have a flying saucer coming in and interfering with this V-2 rocket test. So the flying saucers were coming in and interfering with them, and of course the Air Force at the time was would react to this, and so they sent their squadrons of craft to intercept these flying saucers, or these flying wing craft, these squadrons that were interfering with the rocket tests that the Army and the Air Force were conducting out of places like White Sands missile range. But because the Germans had perfected their anti-gravity or their directed energy weapon technologies, they were able to intercept all of the aircraft that was sent against them by the Navy, by the Army, Air Force, and so here you have in a book by Timothy Good, Need to Know, you have a reference to a period that discusses exactly the kind of losses that occurred in a 2-month period. So, quote, from research conducted to date, over 60 US Army and Navy aircraft, B-29s, B-17s, Corsairs, P-80s, AT-6s, P-51s, C-47s, etc., were lost over this 2-month period, May 1950 to April 1951. 120 airmen were killed and 74 others injured in these incidents, end quote. So this tells us that these aircraft that had been sent to intercept the UFOs that were interfering with the rocket tests, that were also conducting surveillance over the nuclear facilities such as the Roswell Army Airfield, that these aircraft, when they were sent to intercept these flying saucers, often they encountered problems, the aircraft was shot down, and there were significant casualties. So, you know, then we have this, the Air Force conducts an investigation of the flying saucer phenomenon during this time. So, you know, obviously, 1947, you have lots of sightings of flying saucers. The public isn't told about the relationship between the flying saucers and many aircraft being shot down, because the aircraft was sent to intercept the flying saucers. So, but really, what was one of the purposes, one of the real goals behind Project Blue Book was to hide the truth about the origins of flying saucers, that the German secret space program built with extraterrestrial assistance and interplanetary craft flying over US territory with impunity and interfering with rocket tests. So, you know, basically what I'm saying here is that during this period, the Air Force investigation of flying saucers knew we're talking about the leaders. We're not talking about like people like Edward Ruppelt, who was running Project Blue Book. He was only a captain. And I think the most senior officer running Project Blue Book at the time was a major friend in the 1960s. So, I mean, a major in the US hierarchy is still a junior officer. So really, when it came to what was behind the flying saucer phenomenon, the senior leadership knew that there were two things that were flying up there. There were the German secret spacecraft, and there were extraterrestrial spacecraft. And they were trying with great difficulty to try and work out who was who. So that was part of the problem, not knowing who was running which program and who was responsible for any flying saucer sighting. So now we fast track over to July 1952, the Washington DC flyover, probably one of the most famous flyovers in US history, where you had over 3 successive weekends. You had squadrons of flying saucers flying over the Capitol. Air Force jets were scrambled to intercept these craft. There were radar trackings. There were, of course, pilot sightings of the craft. There were hundreds of thousands of witnesses to these craft. So this was a phenomenon that was widely understood to be a very serious one at the time. And certainly the Truman administration took it very seriously. President Truman, basically, he gave the authorization to shoot them down. So here's a report from July 28, 1952. It's a major newspaper clipping, and it tells us that jets told to shoot down flying saucers. So this was an order given by President Truman to the Air Force to shoot down the flying saucers. Now, of course, the Air Force had already tried to shoot these things down, and they hadn't had much success at all. I mean, certainly the Roswell crash and the Los Angeles air raid crash does suggest that these craft were not invulnerable. But nevertheless, whatever the Germans were flying, when the Germans were attacked, they would respond with devastating consequences. So Truman decided that this was not such a good idea, after he was advised that this could be counterproductive, because what happens if all of a sudden Air Force jets start crashing after being told to shoot down these flying discs, and people see the remains of these Air Force jets, plummeting to Earth. So that wasn't a good idea. So basically, Truman revoked the shoot-down orders. But what was really important was that the Air Force had tried and had failed to intercept and shoot down these German flying saucers. And I discuss that at great length in the book. Also in the Antarctica's Hidden History book, I also discussed the 1952 case, the overflights, that these were German flying saucers, and the consequences of that in terms of, well, if you don't have the capability to shoot down an enemy that can fly over your major population centers, then you are experiencing, you're in a, you probably have to come up with a different strategy, and the strategy was one of negotiation. So we'll talk a bit about that now pretty soon. So as I mentioned, Antarctica's Hidden History, you can get more information about the German secret space program and how that was behind that 1952 incident and the negotiations that soon followed. So what we have then in 1954, President Eisenhower gets elected, and he goes to meet with Nordic-looking extraterrestrials at Edwards Air Force Base on the evening of February 20, 1954. So this is a pretty significant event, because it tells us that it wasn't just a matter of Germans working with their extraterrestrial allies. And in the Antarctica's Hidden History book, I talk about the Germans working very closely with a group of reptilian-looking extraterrestrials called the Draconians. The Draconians had actually helped Hitler, helped Germany set up their space program down in Antarctica, and that the Draconians were behind the German space program making really rapid advances and becoming a space power. So that tells us that, you know, there's one group of extraterrestrials that had helped the Germans. And of course, most people, one of the questions a lot of people ask is, well, if the Germans were being helped by these reptilian extraterrestrials to win the Second World War, well, how come they didn't win? Well, the answer is that the Allies were being helped by the other side, secretly. Nordic extraterrestrials were helping the Allies defeat the Axis powers, who had secretly made agreements with these reptilian extraterrestrials. So in a way, World War II was a proxy war. So that's something really worth thinking about, it being a proxy war. So anyway, so now we fast forward, the Germans and possibly other groups flew over the White House in July of 1952. President Eisenhower is elected in November of 1952, and so negotiations begin with these different extraterrestrials. So the first meeting is set up for February 20 of 1954, and that's with President Eisenhower. And so he meets with a delegation of human-looking Nordics at Edwards Air Force Base. So Edwards is one of the most important Air Force facilities for the development of a secret space program, and we'll be talking about that pretty shortly. So anyway, so Eisenhower goes to Edwards Air Force Base in February of 1954, and he meets with the ambassadors of this Nordic extraterrestrial civilization. And so there have been many witnesses that talk about Eisenhower having meetings with these extraterrestrials. You know, William Cooper, probably one of the most well-known. I've discussed it in the Antarctica's Hidden History book. Also, there's another book called Galactic Diplomacy where I talk about this. But Cooper talked about the landing at Muroc, now Edwards Air Force Base, took place in 1954. The base was closed for 3 days and no one was allowed to enter or leave during that time. On the appointed day, the president was spirited to the base. Witnesses to the event have stated that 3 UFOs flew over the base and then landed. President Eisenhower met with the aliens on February 29, 1954. So the different elements of this, in my research, I began doing research on this meeting back in 2003, and my very first book actually discussed it at length. And essentially, I believe that Cooper had it right. Most of the elements here did happen. The base was closed for 3 days. Eisenhower was spirited over there very quickly without the general public knowing or the press being informed. There were a number of UFO craft that landed, and Eisenhower met with Nordic human-looking extraterrestrials. So this, I believe, is absolutely what happened. So the Navy, as a result of those kinds of meetings and that outreach, the Navy began working with the Nordic extraterrestrials secretly, because Eisenhower was persuaded by the national security advisors not to accept agreement with the Nordics. And the important thing to keep in mind is that at the time, the Rockefeller family were very important part of the the Eisenhower administration. Nelson Rockefeller, in particular, was the one responsible for reorganizing the U.S. bureaucracy. So he was the one that was basically advising Eisenhower on how to set up a secrecy system where the US government could conduct all of this classified research on flying saucer technologies, on extraterrestrial vehicles, on responding to the Germans in Antarctica, could do all that secretly by setting up by reorganizing government in some way. So Rockefeller was an important part of that. He eventually became Eisenhower's national security advisor. So he and other major forces within the national security system, including Henry Kissinger, advised Eisenhower against reaching an agreement with the Nordics. So Eisenhower said no to the Nordics. And this is really where we get into a very important part of US history, because even though Eisenhower said no to the Nordics, and the national security system and the Majestic 12 group basically ignored the Nordics, the US Navy secretly began to cooperate with them. And that's how the Navy secretly developed a space program without the Majestic 12 group, without the executive branch of the government knowing anything about it. Now, how could the Navy have done this? Could they have done it? Definitely. Yeah, they could have done it. The Navy, anyone that does research on the Navy very quickly finds that the Navy is really good at keeping secrets. Much better than the Air Force, much better than the Army even. The Navy, they just have a really opaque system that no one knows what the hell is going on. And so that's the way the Navy does it. And so the Navy, according to the research I've done, and I laid it all out in the book, The US Navy's Secret Space Program, they began collaborating with the Nordics. But as far as the US national security system is concerned, and the Air Force in particular, which we are going to be looking at in depth, they were not going to be cooperating with this particular group of Nordics. They were going to be cooperating with the same group that the Germans were working with. So Eisenhower's second meeting involved the German Secret Space Program ET Alliance. So Eisenhower secretly travels to Holloman Air Force Base in February 1955 for another secret meeting with a delegation representing German extraterrestrial alliance. And this is, I cover this in the new book in great detail, but essentially Eisenhower met with this delegation representing this German extraterrestrial alliance out of Antarctica, and an agreement was reached. People who were there that witnessed the meetings said that Eisenhower came out of the spacecraft and basically shook hands with its occupants, so suggesting that an agreement had been reached with the occupants of that craft. And certainly that's what happened according to the research I conducted. So as I mentioned, you can go into more detail with some of the many witnesses who discussed this meeting at Holloman Air Force Base in the book Galactic Diplomacy. And now in that book, I didn't talk about the German space program at all, because at that time, writing that, I didn't realize that the Germans had set up a space program in Antarctica. So this book was authored in 2013. This was before some of the more recent secret space program whistleblowers came forward. I first started to cover this story in 2014 with Randy Kramer and with Corey Good that came forward late 2014, and then 2015 went into more depth as Bill Tompkins came forward, and more whistleblowers came forward to kind of like give information, really pointing that the Germans had set up a base in Antarctica and had reached agreements with the Eisenhower administration. So that was very new information for me. So that's been updated in this new book. But nevertheless, the old book gives you a lot of information about these early meetings. So that Galactic Diplomacy book will give you information about those older meetings. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, he talked about an agreement that had been reached. He had said we had negotiated a kind of surrender with them. He didn't stipulate who the them were, as long as we couldn't fight them. They dictated the terms because they knew what we feared was disclosure, end quote. So that kind of gives you an idea into Corso's thinking at the time. And Corso worked for Army Intelligence, G2, in the 1950s. And I think that he did know that the Germans had survived the war and were operating out of Antarctica, and he was communicating this information in this, in this way, where he left it vague as to exactly who the surrender had been negotiated with. But I think he was talking about this German extraterrestrial alliance. So after the Eisenhower administration was forced to reach an agreement, the Fourth Reich infiltrated the US military-industrial complex, especially the US Air Force and the CIA. So this was a very important part of exactly how the US military-industrial complex was infiltrated and taken over. Operation Paperclip was really critical in all of this. Everyone, I think most people know that approximately 1,600 German scientists were brought over officially under Operation Paperclip into the United States to help kickstart the US space program, to research on rocket technologies and other exotic technologies that the Germans had expertise in. Now, of course, this was a double-edged sword, because while the US Air Force and the US military-industrial complex hoped to gain all the secrets that they could from these German scientists who were aware of what the Germans had done, both in Nazi Germany and also were doing in Antarctica to some extent, they were aware of that. What they didn't realize was the extent to which these German scientists would basically become a fifth column and undermine the US military-industrial complex and make it something that the Fourth Reich could infiltrate and take over. And that's exactly what happened. And William Tompkins says that when he went to the Marshall Space Flight Center in 1961 to discuss the creation of a space command, or a command center, or launch command center for the upcoming Apollo program at the Kennedy Space Center, that he saw a flag that was a merger of the Stars and Stripes and the swastika. So here's an example of what Tompkins saw back at the Marshall Space Flight Center back in 1961. Charles Hall is a very important source also for giving us an idea of the extent to which the Air Force was working with these different extraterrestrial groups. Hall says that from 1965 to 1967, he was stationed out at Nellis Air Force Base, and that he was basically liaising with these tall white extraterrestrials. You can see them here, kind of like a hybrid race of a grey and a Nordic extraterrestrial race, some kind of hybrid race that was very intelligent and very advanced technologically speaking. And so Hall described what had happened when he was sent out to the Nellis Air Force Range to meet with these tall white extraterrestrials. Quote, "The decision to send me and no one else out to the ranges was made by a committee of individuals that included the tall whites, as well as high-ranking US Air Force generals and other high-ranking members of the US government. The tall whites are very meticulous about keeping their agreements and expect the US government to be equally meticulous about keeping its agreements as well." So Hall is here telling us that the Air Force was working with tall white extraterrestrials along with others dating back to the 1950s. This is based on what Hall learned back in 1965-67. One of the things Hall mentioned was that the agreements went back to mid-1950s. He mentioned that the US Air Force was only given information for short-range spacecraft. So Hall said that the tall whites only shared information for atomic-powered spacecraft capable of short trips, such as to the moon. But they were denied information for longer-range interplanetary craft, and that information was just withheld from the Air Force. So the tall whites didn't want to share these more advanced technology secrets, and basically were encouraging the Air Force just to use rocket technologies or atomic-powered technologies for their space program, saying that these more developed technologies, say, such as torsion field physics, using torsion fields, anti-gravity technologies and so forth, that these were something that would be shared later. But for now, developing atomic-powered spacecraft was the way to go. So this takes us now to the Air Force finally moving forward in using its rocket program to develop its first space stations. Now, the US Air Force partnered with the National Reconnaissance Office in first proposing the development of a manned orbiting laboratory. This was something that was announced by President Johnson in 1963, and it was cancelled in 1969. So basically what the public was told was that the Apollo program, sorry, not the Apollo program, but this was a military-run program. This was not a civilian program. So this was run by the US Air Force and the NRO. But the Air Force was going to send the second stage of a Titan II rocket, which was used for the Gemini program. The second stage would basically comprise this, what you see here on the screen, which was called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. And as you can see, it's a modular design, and you have different modules here. You have the main cabin, you have the auxiliary cabin, the experiment module, the equipment module, and the trans stage, which is basically the engine that would be used to move this in space. So that way, if it needed to go up higher in orbit or moving to a different orbital path, the trans stage could be used for that. And then you have the Gemini capsule at the very top, which is where the pilots could get in and out of to fly back down to Earth, or even to move from one of these modules to another module if necessary. So this was an Air Force program that did receive funding. It received billions of dollars in funding from 63 right through to 69. So it was funded and then cancelled in 1969. But the problem was that the public was told only part of the truth in terms of its cancellation. It wasn't told the full truth. So, and this is where there were 825 National Reconnaissance Office documents that were declassified in 2015, which I discuss in the new book on the Air Force Secret Space Program in great detail. And these documents lay out how the Air Force, rather than eliminating the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, that they secretly continued it. What they cancelled was phase 1, which was supposed to be the manned aspect, but they continued with phase 2, which was set up initially to be an unmanned program. And so these declassified National Reconnaissance Office documents lay out how the Air Force and the NRO basically pulled a fast one on the public. They only publicly cancelled one phase or one aspect of this MOL program and secretly continued the other aspect using funds that they were able to gather from other sources for contractors. So the declassified document that I refer to here is the MOL program advanced planning that was issued on March 17 of 1967. It shows that the funding and planning for phase 2 were completely separated from the basic MOL program. MOL stands for Manned Orbiting Laboratory. This made it possible for the basic MOL program to be publicly cancelled down the track while the advanced program, phase 2, involving more complex projects and objectives, assembling a type of von Braun station in space, could continue uninterrupted as a covert program. So there you have the name of the document and where to find it online. So this shows you that, yeah, the MOLE program did have these 2 phases, and only the 1 phase was cancelled. And there are more documents I discuss in the book that lay out exactly how this 2nd phase was secretly continued. So this is the von Braun station. I showed you earlier the 1952 illustration, but von Braun's 1946 illustration is much more important, because what you can see here is that this is a figure. This is kind of like a spherical or circular design. Now, of course, the spokes into the center with some sort of connecting corridor between the center and the different sections back there. Oops, sorry about that. What you see here is each edge is straight. So this was, from the beginning, the von Braun station was designed to be created in a modular fashion using modules. Now, I've just spent a little bit of time discussing the manned orbiting laboratory. That was a program set up to create these modules, and each module could be pieced together into creating something like this, where you actually have a space station, a ring-shaped space station, based on the early design of von Braun. So this is what really was the goal behind the MOLE program. That the initial funding, this is the way in which the Air Force often operates, is that a program will be announced, it'll get funding, billions of dollars in funding. In 6 years, the MOLE program got over $10 billion in funding, and then it's cancelled. Well, what's the show for all of that? Well, that funding is now, and whatever's been created now goes into the classified world, and so the public doesn't know anything about it. So that's what happened with the MOLE program. Went into this classified program where these space stations were secretly built. So this is one of the documents that I retrieved from the National Reconnaissance Office website. This is the 2015 declassification that the NRO had put up on its website. And this shows you that the MOLE program actually was piecing together these different modules to form this kind of this spiked arrangement with 3 spikes coming out, and there would be solar arrays on each spike coming out. Now each of these spikes was modules from the MOLE program. So this was actually laying out, oops, sorry about that, and this diagram is laying out how a space station could be built that could this was designed as a command station. So this would be a command station set up using the MOLE modules. So what you have here is evidence, documentary evidence, that the MOLE program was never intended to just be about placing these surveillance cylinders up in space using Gemini capsules and to kind of conduct surveillance activities using just these MOLE modules. That the plan all along was to link these together into different configurations. This was one of the big configurations. This was a basic configuration, a command port, and that could house up to 40 astronauts. So that's 40. That's much more than what the MOLE program was originally designed to be. So this this gives you an idea of just how many MOLE modules they plan to kind of link together in space to form these things, and to then have 40 astronauts up there. So on the right, you have the the rockets. This was a Titan III rocket, which the top stage, or the second stage, would comprise the different modules. So this is how it would look. We already kind of mentioned that a little earlier, the breakdown, but this is just gives you another perspective in terms of this, the upper stage, or stage 2 of a Titan III rocket. So these things, these cylinders, these would form the kind of different spikes and different components of either the command module that I just showed you here. Each of these would be comprised of these different, a number of these all linked together, or they could be linked together in a kind of ring-shaped fashion, similar to the Von Braun station. And interestingly, this is what Corey Goode, who, as many of you I'm sure know, is very prominent as a secret space program insider. According to my information, Corey is legitimate. He's a genuine insider. I found sources corroborating his information. I've come across documents that he's released that have proved to be authentic, as well as met some high-level NATO officials that corroborate him. And we're talking at the level, flag officer level. So I am convinced that Corey Goode is the real deal. And so when he says that the space station that the Air Force and the NRO have set up, that there are 2, maybe 3 or more of these kind of ring-shaped space stations that are run by the Air Force and the NRO, and that these have a kind of 9-sided configuration. Very interesting. So each of these sides would comprise those kind of modules that I mentioned. And Corey said that, you know, these were all put together using disused components of rockets that were sent up into space. So that is partially correct, because rather than being diffused, I believe what these were in fact the modules that were being sent up out of Vandenberg Air Force Base from the early 1970s onwards to build these space stations, so that by 1985 you could have Ronald Reagan reporting on what he was told. So, you know, this is a very famous part. He said in his Reagan diaries, lunch with 5 top space scientists. It was fascinating. Space truly is the last frontier, and some of the developments there in astronomy, etc., are like science fiction, except they are real. I learned that our shuttle capacity is such that we could orbit 300 people in space. And of course, that, to me, that is a very incriminating statement. It is admitting that something was up there in space, that the Air Force could place 300 astronauts up there, and it wasn't the space shuttle program, which was only beginning at the time. There were only 5 shuttles that could only hold a maximum of 10, and these were delivery systems. These were not designed to be orbital space stations. The space shuttle was never meant to be up in space for any prolonged period of time. It was just to deliver people back and forth. And this is what it did for years and years and years. Because really what was up there was these space stations. Now, how do you get astronauts up to these space stations? Oops, sorry about that. How do you get them up to this space station that had been secretly assembled by the Air Force, by the NRO? Well, you need to have delivery systems. Well, there are a number of delivery systems, and I discussed these in the recent book. The one that I was going to mention now, that's I think very significant, is these ARVs that were witnessed in 1988 by Brad Sorensen at Edwards Air Force Base. Now, this is a design based on what Sorensen saw that he shared with a patent illustrator by the name of Mark McClandish. And McClandish has provided very detailed descriptions of this ARV vehicle in 1988 that was witnessed. One of the helpful things to keep in mind is that when Sorensen went to Edwards Air Force Base, he says that he saw 3 of these vehicles. They were different sizes. There was a small, medium, and a larger size. The larger size from the top, I remember being around 60 feet or so, the smaller being 20 to 30 feet. And these were different sizes, and they had different flight characteristics. And there was one of them, there was a cutaway of one of them that you could read all of the detailed information about its design. So this was designed for aircraft developers. So this was basically the Air Force showing off the stuff it had to, for people within the aircraft industry to see if they could come up with any kind of innovations or anything new to improve upon what they had. So McClandish discussed this in great detail based on the testimony of Sorensen. And what we know from McClandish's testimony, and he was one of the original witnesses to the Disclosure Project press conference back in 2001, one of the people that was very clearly laying out that there is a secret space program back in 2001, he laid out the characteristics of this craft, and one of the things that I find very interesting is that this dovetails with statements from Ben Rich from Lockheed Martin, who was the head of Skunk Works during this period of time. And this was around the period of time that Ben Rich was giving lectures saying that, well, you know, he began in 1983 giving lectures saying that, well, we've been given the contract to get ET home. By 1993, he was saying that, well, we've been given, we now have the technology to take Rich home. Now, to take ETs home. So Rich was really laying out through a joke that the US Air Force had developed these ARV vehicles and that they were capable of interstellar flight. So this gives us an idea of just how far the Air Force space program had come by the 1980s. Remember in the early 1960s where the Air Force was given help in developing some flying saucer technologies by the Tall Whites, and other extraterrestrial groups such as the Greys were also helping. By the 1980s, the Air Force had already developed operational flying saucers. But it wasn't just flying saucers that the Air Force had, you know, because the Air Force could use these flying saucers to deliver people or to supply the space stations that had been secretly assembled using modules in Earth orbit. The Air Force also had flying triangles. So this is the TR-3B. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with people who began talking about the TR-3B and its capabilities. Essentially, it uses some sort of magneto-hydrodynamic technology to reduce the weight of the craft by a factor of 87%, which means that it's capable of attaining propulsion speeds much greater than conventional craft. That it uses this kind of torsion field technology where you have Mercury rotating in a kind of ring-shaped path very, very quickly at high pressures, around 60,000 revolutions per minute, to create this kind of gravity reduction effect, while at the same time you have engines that are atomic powered to provide it with thrust. Now the thing is, if this craft has its weight reduced by a factor of 87%, then you would need much less thrust to do things like go into outer Earth orbit or to even travel to the moon and so forth. So this is one of the things that the TR3 was capable of doing, and the Air Force got its hands on these in the 1980s. This is something that whistleblowers and insiders like Edgar Fouché began talking about. Edgar Fouché, he emerged in 1999 after publication of his book Alien Rapture, and he says that the TR-3B launches out of the S4 facility at Area 51, and it's the most advanced aerospace vehicle belonging to the Air Force. So that was the information that he had, and he based that information on the testimonies of, there was a group of 6 insiders that he worked with. He was one of that group, and they all shared the information that they had on these technologies. And he was told when he was writing his book that he could write on anything as long as he had not directly, personally experienced that program himself. So here in the book Alien Rapture, he is writing about the TR-3B in terms of what his colleagues had told him. They couldn't write about it, but he could. They shared it all with him. So he described it operating out of Area 51 back in the early 1980s. Of course, in the, sorry, I should have said late 1980s, because that's also when the first mass sightings began in places like Belgium. From 1989 to 1990, there were mass sightings of these flying triangles. So this is the Belgium UFO wave, seen by tens of thousands of people, just lots of sightings. So, that gives us an idea of some of the vehicles that the Air Force has in its arsenal of flying saucer technologies. So Emery Smith, from 1992 to 1997, he also was exposed to some of these advanced technologies that the Air Force used. And he says that he witnessed some of the reverse engineering of the captured extraterrestrial craft at Kirtland Air Force Base. So he describes having actually seen some of these and actually being asked to work on them, because he was an expert on the biology of alien life, and because some of these spacecraft were organic, that actually displayed kind of like characteristics of organic life forms, that he was called upon to give information about that. So he's given us some information about extraterrestrials that were working with the Air Force in developing some of these technologies, and they were part of the classified program. Now these human-looking extraterrestrials, along with the tall whites, the reptilians, the greys, this is a different group. It's important to point out that this is a different group to the group that was working with the Navy. This was a group that was part of this Reptilian extraterrestrial alliance that was working with the Germans out of Antarctica. The agreements with the Draco-German alliance led to the torture of captured Nordics. So those Nordics, or those human-looking extraterrestrials that were captured, they were tortured for information. This is something Corey Good shared on an episode of Cosmic Disclosure. He talked about it with Corey Good, and so there's an episode there, and that's the article on my website where I talk about it. It's also discussed in the new book. Now we get to the part where the Air Force begins to suspect that the kind of technologies that they developed, the flying saucers, the TR-3Bs, the being able to develop space stations using these modules that were adapted from the abandoned manned orbiting laboratory program, that all of that technology was really redundant or was really antiquated compared with what the Navy had, that the US Navy had developed because they had been working with another group of human-looking Nordic extraterrestrials. The Navy had developed things like these kind of kilometre-long cigar-shaped craft that were capable of interstellar flight. This was something that the Air Force didn't know existed. And senior Air Force officials, when they learned about this, they were shocked. Now, according to Corey Good, because this Corey says that he actually met with this guy, that this was the guy that was abducting him and doing forced interrogations of him using chemicals and so forth, and eventually began to believe what Corey was sharing. So this person that Corey dubbed Sigmund said that that this group within the Air Force really wanted to find out the details of this alleged Navy secret space program, because he said to Corey that, quote, "I used to think we were the tip of the spear, but I found out we're the effing Coast Guard," end quote. So right there, you have a kind of very honest assessment by a senior Air Force official involved in running the secret Air Force space program. His shock at learning that after decades of working with these reptilians and other extraterrestrial groups, as well as the Germans in Antarctica, that all along the Navy had its own program that it had developed with human-looking extraterrestrials that was much more advanced than what the Air Force had been allowed to develop with the assistance of this reptilian German alliance. So, you know, obviously right there, that's going to have profound repercussions, because it's going to tell you a lot about who to work with. Sigmund said that there are two remaining explanations for Corey's revelations. After he had interrogated Corey, he said there's these two explanations. Visiting group of Nordic extraterrestrials known to the MI6 is manipulating Corey through mind control and feeding him accurate information from an unknown agenda. Or two, Corey is associated with a Navy-run secret space program, which is part of a secret space program alliance. And he's also working with a visiting group of extraterrestrials called the Sphere Being Alliance. So, you know, those are the two explanations. And apparently, according to Corey, Sigmund believed the first, but suspected the second, and eventually found out that the second was the truth. So, so then we have the Air Force beginning its efforts to start revealing the truth, because I think the Air Force people realized that everything that they had been told was only a partial truth, that there was much more advanced technology that was capable of being developed, but they were just being denied access. And so that the Air Force thought that, well, one of the ways to do this was to reveal what it knew to the general public, so that way it could get its hands on some of the things that the Navy had been developing. So around this time, we have photos of anti-gravity craft being shown near MacDill Air Force Base. So this began towards the end of 2017. So this is around the same time that Corey said he was having his experiences with Sigmund, and Sigmund had learned that the Navy had a secret space program that the Air Force had been lied to. I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly because it's in the book, and I want to give you enough time to ask questions at the end of this. So I'll go through it. And what you see in front of you, these are all articles on my website, exopolitics.org, where you get the details. But here you see this kind of like a triangle-shaped craft with some kind of tail powering up. And that powering up process is a characteristic of some kind of space-time technology being utilized, such as the torsion field device on the TR3B that we mentioned earlier, that, you know, when the plasma starts flying around the ring, so here you have the plasma going around the ring, maybe it's reaching, you know, 50,000 revolutions per minute, Now it's going at 60, 70,000, so it's generating a torsion field effect. And so here you have the the power up of the craft. So this is some sort of triangle-shaped craft, which seems to be a later model of the TR-3B. According to my source, this craft was around 60 feet in length. Interestingly, as the Air Force was disclosing, making this move to disclose the truth, and getting people like my source in Florida to reveal what the Air Force had in terms of its secret space program, the major base, MacDill Air Force Base, which is home to two major commands. It's home to Central Command, which runs all of the US military operations in the Middle East. It's also home to Special Operations Command, which is what runs all special operations both on Earth and off planet. So MacDill is a hub for that. And it's interesting that as my source is revealing through photographs that he's being directed to take by people within the covert program, he's being prodded to take these photos, and he's taking photos of the different shaped craft that we are seeing here, and revealing these to the public. And that's one of the things that I've been doing since 2017 is revealing his photos. So here you have more triangle sightings. Here, this one, you have a triangle sighting from September. And here, my source, JP, he photographed a helicopter tracking this flying triangle. So here, again, is the helicopter. Here's the flying triangle. Again, the helicopter, flying triangle. So it's as though it's being escorted towards MacDill Air Force Base. So these flying triangles are flying into MacDill Air Force Base and out of it as this hurricane is approaching. And the Air Force Base was evacuated one day before the hurricane hit. So I think that what was really going on was that this was payback for the Air Force, disclosing some of the aircraft or some of the anti-gravity craft it had in its arsenal. So here you have covert disclosure of anti-gravity craft near MacDill Air Force Base. So here you have a photo of a rectangle-shaped craft, and this is, according to my source, he says he was taken on board this craft. He's also been taken on board these triangle-shaped craft because he has been a long-term contactee, and the Air Force Secret Space Program became very interested in him because he's been having contacts with the Nordics for a long time. So they wanted to know what technologies the Nordics were developing, and they wanted his help in terms of developing some of these technologies. So that's why he's been monitored by them, and he's been taking on board some of their craft, and he's given me information about it. But basically the point is that JP was being encouraged to reveal the truth of what's behind these different rectangle and triangle shaped craft. So here's more where JP said that he met personnel on this particular rectangle craft, that he was taken on board it. He was taken on board it, and there were personnel from Air Force Special Operations. So the Air Force Special Operations, these were the guys that were manning this, and this tells us that this is not a craft that is under development, but it's part of a wing of anti-gravity craft that is manned and operated by personnel out of Air Force Special Operations. And that becomes pretty relevant when I talk about Space Force, and I'll be talking about that pretty soon. So, more of these triangle-shaped craft as Hurricane Irma approached Florida back in September of 2017. So now we talked about this, the role of the Air Force in stopping a false flag attack on Hawaii in January of 2018. This is only 4 months after you had Hurricane Irma devastate Florida and led to the evacuation of McDill Air Force Base as kind of payback, as punishment for the Air Force sponsoring or encouraging this covert disclosure of some of its space program or some of its spacecraft technologies. And so on January 13, 2018, just to kind of summarize very quickly, residents of Hawaii received a ballistic missile alert, told to take shelter, and for about half an hour, people in Hawaii were in a panic because they thought that they were being attacked by a ballistic missile carrying a nuclear weapon from North Korea. Then the state of Hawaii issued an apology, said this was a mistake, and this was a mistake, it was all a false alarm, and just forget about it. But as it turns out, according to the research I've done, and I did a chapter on this in the new book, just laying out all of the evidence that this was, in fact, a real ballistic missile attack carrying a nuclear weapon designed to be a false flag attack where North Korea would be blamed, thereby starting a Third World War. And it was shut down by the Air Force Secret Space Program. And this is really a momentous event. And if I'm right, and of course I think I'm right because there is evidence there, this really is going to become known as a pivotal event in our history as a planet developing into a galactic civilization. Because I think this was the time when the Air Force stood its ground to this deep state and said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to allow this to happen. And they shut it down. Because if it had been allowed to hit Hawaii, the Trump administration would have been forced to retaliate against North Korea because North Korea would have been presented as the patsy. All the evidence was laid out for North Korea being the patsy. And then there would have been a nuclear response against North Korea. Then Russia and China would have come into the defense of North Korea because they would have known that North Korea was being framed. And that's how the Third World War was going to start. That was the plan that had been laid out by the deep state. Why did it fail? It was because the Air Force decided to join the White Hats. So history is going to look very kindly on what the Air Force did at that time. So the Air Force now has begun cooperating with Nordic extraterrestrials that had been helping the Navy all along, because the Air Force had realized that they'd been lied to all this time, and these human-looking extraterrestrials were the ones that could be trusted, the ones that were working with the Navy. These were the good guys. The other ones, the ones that were working with the Germans, couldn't be trusted. So this was really part of the big realignment, the shift. In the book, I talk about the shifting extraterrestrial alliances, and this is it. This is what happened. The Air Force Secret Space Program realigned their affiliation from working with this reptilian group comprising greys, some tall whites, insectoids, and some human-looking extraterrestrials, and cooperating with this other group, predominantly human-looking Nordics. There's a document here, the new Majestic document, that kind of lays out a new history for how the Air Force is going to roll this out to the general public. So there's kind of some historical revisionism that's going to be happening here. And this document that was released on June 14, 2017 is authentic. It's been corroborated by Dr. Robert Wood, who's done really great research in corroborating key elements on it, and he's identified some of the officials that were involved in it. And you can get that information either through my website, exopolitics.org, or in the new book. But it lays out how the Air Force, along with the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, the NSA, believe that human-looking extraterrestrials are the most friendly and the ones that we have been diplomatically working with since the 1950s. So there's some historical revisionism happening here. They're laying out their version of history. I mean, it's very understandable. It doesn't quite agree with my understanding, but this is what scholarship is all about, reconciling things. So, but nevertheless, this document is an important one because it lays out how the public is going to be informed about human-looking extraterrestrials being our friends. So this gives you more details about this document, laying out this new history, which is the first majestic document that ever talked about human-looking extraterrestrials. All the other majestic documents have always talked about non-human-looking groups, greys, insectoids, and so forth. So this one talks about the human-looking groups. And here you have 4 types of EBEs that are identified: Earth-like humanoids, and describes us more or less like ourselves. The majority of these are friendly and are the bulk of our EBE contacts. So right there you have a really important admission saying that most of the contact that the Air Force, the Defense Intelligence Agency have had with extraterrestrials has been with these human-looking groups. Most have a high degree of psychic ability and all use science and engineering in an advanced nature. And then it goes on into the other groups, that we know of, the greys, non-humanoids, transmorphic, and so forth. I talk about that in the online article that you might want to consult to just get a little more information about those different groups, or by consulting the document itself. But the important thing for us is that there's been a major realignment, a major shift. The Air Force is now openly associating itself with these human-looking extraterrestrials, who they describe as you can see here, the majority of these are friendly. So only a few are unfriendly. And who are the unfriendly Earth-like humanoids? They are the ones that were working with the reptilians and the greys and the insectoids that had tricked the Air Force Secret Space Program for decades, taking them into non-productive technology development. And in this revisionist history, it talks about a meeting that occurred at Kirtland Air Force Base in 1954. I don't want to go into this now because I don't have much time, but essentially it's laying out a new version of history. I hadn't heard of this Kirtland Air Force Base meeting before. I find it very interesting that this is where Emery Smith says that he worked and where he came across the Air Force Secret Space Program. So I don't want to dismiss it. I think it's something. It's an additional piece of information that we need to reconcile with the other meetings that we know President Eisenhower was involved in. But certainly in the 1950s, President Eisenhower was meeting with different delegations of extraterrestrials, and there could have been a meeting at Kirtland as well. More photos from my from my source JP showing these kind of cylinder-shaped craft that he says belong to the Nordic extraterrestrials that were partnering with the Air Force. So this happened in September of 2017, September 14, 2017, 3 days after the evacuation of MacDill. This cylinder-shaped craft appeared, and according to my source JP, it was just to show the Air Force that the Nordics were watching over the Air Force, helping them. In May of in early 2018, my source moved to Orlando, and he starts meeting with Nordics in Air Force uniforms. And he says that the Nordics were working with the Air Force, that he met one who landed his craft This was the craft that was photographed by JP. It landed near his home in Florida, in Orlando, and JP met the extraterrestrial, and the extraterrestrial said that they were helping the Air Force develop their advanced technologies, developing more powerful anti-gravity spacecraft. Okay, and what's important here is that JP said that this Nordic, he said that Nordic was different, that he had crew cut hairstyle, not the long hair depicted in this photo here, but nevertheless was wearing an Air Force uniform with a particular patch that was unique. So Emery Smith, Corey Good have talked about extraterrestrials living amongst us. I mean, this is important admissions that shows that these human-looking ETs have been with us for decades. You know, this photo dates back to the High Bridge incident in New Jersey in 1958, I believe. So yeah, these human-looking ETs have been here a long time. Okay, so finally we get to Space Force. So, you know, want to kind of spend 10 minutes on Space Force and then maybe then give you 20 minutes of Q&A to raise your questions. So, you know, given everything that I've said, that, you know, the Air Force has done this complete realignment. It has now shifted its allegiance with, you know, from one group of extraterrestrials to this human-looking Nordic group that has been working with the Navy for decades, and the Air Force wants to get out of this new alliance more advanced technologies that it can use to beef up its secret arsenal that I've already described: the flying triangles, the flying rectangles, the flying saucers, and the space stations it has up there. But the Air Force wants to develop these so that they become much more advanced, because they know that the Germans were holding back in the kind of technologies that truly exist and can be developed. So, you know, to put it simply, the Air Force wants to have its own flying aircraft carriers. It doesn't want to be subservient to the Navy. I mean, it's kind of like bottom line. That's it. Kind of that institutional rivalry. And rather than the Air Force going down that track of duplicating what the Navy has done, Space Force has been set up as a process by which the Space Force can aggregate all of the Air Force space assets and eventually bring on board all of the Navy assets in a new department of the Space Force. So that's really what Trump wants to do. He wants to set up a department of the Space Force. And so there's a number of steps here because that's going to require revealing different aspects of the Air Force's secret space program. And so we're going to be talking about the difference between a department of the Space Force and Space Force as a sixth branch of the US military. And there's a big difference between the two, and I'll explain that as we go. So in August 9, 2018, the Department of Defense issued a report based on Donald Trump saying that he wanted the Department of Defense to set up a Department of Space Force, and what would be required for this. So this is what the Department of Defense said. Quote, establishing the Space Force will be multi-dimensional and multi-dimensional and phased. In this first phase, the Department of the Defense will establish several of the compartment parts of the Space Force. The second phase requires Congress to combine these components into the sixth branch of the armed forces. Department of Defense, I'm sorry about that, but I cannot read that last line there. The screen has dropped off for me. Department of Defense is immediately pursuing 4 components. Okay, so this is the strategy that the Department of Defense is going to put into establishing Space Force as Donald Trump has called for it. First, it's going to be the development of a space development agency. They're going to shift from an acquisition organization and mindset to a development organization focused on experimentation, prototyping, and accelerated fielding. So what does that mean? So the goal here for Space Force is to assert authority over corporate contractors building advanced spacecraft components. The ground-shaking result will be that corporations can no longer get away with secretly building components for other space programs without informing the Air Force. So this was part of the trick, a part of the way in which the Air Force was deceived, because the Air Force didn't have control over all of the different corporate contractors building advanced technologies for these spacecraft components that Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman or General Dynamics, all of these aerospace companies were building not only for the Air Force, but for the Navy, corporate contractors, for the German program, and any other customers out there. Now, with Space Force, you're going to have the development of this Space Development Agency, where it is going to be responsible for building, for doing the experimentation, for prototyping, and the development and fielding of these craft. Essentially, Space Force, through this Space Development Agency, is going to have control over how these technologies are built. Two, Space Operations Force. Create a clear career track for the space community containing all relevant space specialties, including operations, intelligence, engineering, science, acquisition, cyber, etc. So what that means is that a Space Operations Force will make it very difficult for rival space programs led by the Antarctic Germans, the Deep State, and the corporations to secretly recruit US military personnel and civilians using TDY, that stands for temporary duty. That's the acronym used by the Army and the Air Force, or temporary duty assignments, that's used by the Navy and the Marine Corps. Typically what happens is that personnel in the Air Force or Navy or whatever, when they're recruited for any of these secret space programs, they're placed on TDY or TDA, and they go and they serve, and then they come back and they do their regular assignment. And it means that because these are classified programs, they're only, in terms of career advancement, they're only assessed in terms of their conventional career achievements. So if they go and serve for 6 months, a year, TDY on a secret space program or something, or even up to 20 years on a 20 and back, that none of that is acknowledged on their military records. It's all classified. So their career advancement is only measured in terms of their conventional career, and so it makes it difficult and unattractive for people to be recruited to these programs. And so this is why you have 20 and back programs, because it makes it more manageable or more attractive for people if you tell them, well, you can serve for 20 years, you come back, you don't lose anything, there's mine wipes and all of that, but no problem. But now with this Space Operations Force, where everyone who serves in space is tracked, and in terms of career advancement, your service on, say, 6 months or 12 months with Salla Warden, that's all going to go towards your career tracking. You don't need a 20 and back program anymore, because now you're serving 6 months, 12 months, 2 years even, for extended space deployment. No big deal. You go and serve, you come back, you have shore leave, whatever. Everything is credited to your conventional career. You don't have to keep up a conventional career track in parallel with your covert career, which you do using TDAs and TDYs. So this is a really big component of why Space Force is so important, because it gives all of the career personnel in the Air Force and the Navy, the Marine Corps and so forth, motivation to be part of all of this, and to all go to their career to record to their career achievements. And it also makes it very difficult for rival space programs led by the Germans, the deep state and corporations to recruit US military personnel and civilians using TDA and 20 and back, because an Air Force guy that's approached by, you know, General Dynamics or the deep state says, well, we want you to come and serve with us for 20 years and, you know, you'll be given this, and I'll say, well, why should I bother? I can serve with Space Operations Force and it all goes down on my military record and there's no mind wipes or anything. So it makes it much more difficult for these rival programs to move. There's a third component which deals with logistics. I'm going to skip that. The fourth component of this that the Department of Defense recommended in its report to the Trump administration in August of 2018 was the establishment of a United States Space Command, lead US warfighting activities in space, and establish unity of command for operational space forces. Integrate space planning and operations across military campaigns and contingency plans. And that was formally established in December of 2018. So I don't have the date because I didn't see the actual date in front of me. December 18, 2018. So Space Command was officially established on December 18. So it now exists as well, they have to first name the commander of this Space Command before it actually goes into operation. It's been authorized, and now they are in interviews for who's going to be the 4-star general who heads up Space Command. So the goal of Space Command is to prevent space asset technologies created within and for different military services to be secretly siphoned off into black projects run by the deep state corporations and the Antarctic Germans without the knowledge of the US Air Force secret space program. So that's really the goal of Space Command, to really make sure that none of this stuff is siphoned off to all of these other space programs without the Air Force knowing about it. So certainly that's something that deep state didn't want, and which is why they were against this creation of this space force. But nevertheless, it is what is moving forward. Trump's space policy directive, that was a creation of Space Force. He says it will be a 2-step process. So Trump initially said that what he wanted to do was to set up a department of the Space Force, and to have Space Force set up as a 6th branch of the military. He received a lot of pushback because the bureaucracy didn't want a department of the Space Force. What they wanted was Space Force to be created as a 6th branch, but under the Department of the Air Force. So this was the compromise that Trump accepted. Trump's Space Policy Directive 4 that was issued, and that basically outlines that the creation of Space Force will be a 2-step process. It will be initially established within the Department of the Air Force, which is vital to gaining congressional and Air Force support for its legislative passage. But first, it's going to be part of the Department of Defense. Space Force will be part of that. Sorry, part of the Department of this of the Air Force, and later, so Space Force under the Department of the Air Force, and later, Trump's goal is to bring about a department of the Space Force. So he passed this Space Policy Directive in February 2019, and it only implies that the next step will be an independent department of the Space Force in order to overcome the opposition. But this is really the long-term goal that Trump has. So just in a couple of minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So what's the future of Space Force? So Space Force will first aggregate all US military assets deployed in near-Earth orbit. So that's basically the Air Force secret space program. So, so after the creation of a department of the Space Force, the Navy will relinquish control of its deep space assets. So that's what you see on the right-hand side. So we know the Air Force has developed flying triangles, flying saucers, flying rectangles, and these kind of ring-shaped circular space stations. But that's going to be initially rolled out as part of Space Force as it's initially established under the Department of the Air Force as a 6th branch of the US military. But when Space Force is developed or is established as its own independent department and separated from the Air Force, that's when the Navy is going to come on board and relinquish control of its deep space assets. So that's when the Department of the Air Force is going to have control, is going to basically have all of the, and according to Bill Tompkins and Corey Good, the Solar Warden, which is under the Navy, currently has 8 operational space battle groups with space carriers, space destroyers, and cruisers, and so forth. And so these all operate in deep space. And so this will eventually all be brought under the Department of the Space Force. When that's going to happen, I assume it's probably going to happen during Trump's 2nd term under the new Secretary of the Defense, Patrick Shanahan, who knows all about this, because Shanahan was actually an executive with the Boeing Aircraft Company. And as I mentioned earlier, the Boeing Aircraft Company is the successor of the Douglas Aircraft Company and the Advanced Design. So within the Boeing Aircraft Company, you have the entire history of the development of not only the Air Force's secret space program, but also of the development of the Navy's secret space program. So that's why Shanahan is so important to the Trump administration. So Trump knows a lot more. So one of the things about the Navy's Solar Warden program is that it's a multinational program. Of course, as we know now, the Department of the Air Force, it has its own secret space program. And while there is some cooperation with its sister services from countries like Britain, Canada, Australia, that is much more developed in the Solar Warden program, where personnel from these countries and other countries serve. But what will happen is that Space Force, I think, is going to evolve. And will it evolve into something like Starfleet, like in the fictional Starfleet in the Star Trek series? Is that the future of the Department of the Space Force? As it evolves, as the Navy comes on board, discloses all of its space battle groups, what is that all going to be called? Because that is already a multinational force. The Solar Warden program is a multinational force. There are Russians serving on it, there are some Chinese serving on it, as well as Australians, Brits and Canadians and so forth. So what's going to happen as Space Force evolves? I think it's going to basically evolve into something like Starfleet. I think that's the goal that Trump wanted, and whether he succeeds, we'll find out, because I know the deep state wants to set up a centralized system, but I don't think they're going to succeed. But that's presently what's going on. Of course, for my Secret Space Program series that lays all this out, the May 21st release of the US Air Force Secret Space Program, where I lay out everything that I've said. I lay it all out, so you have references and documentation all there in the book. You can pre-order it now through Amazon for Kindle or paperback, or pre-order it on my book, on my exopolitics.org site for an autographed copy. So that's it.